Okay, so good morning, everybody. Two people entered the waiting room. Where did that go? Just a second. I have to let people in. Oh, here we go. Uh, oh, why did I do that? Uh, okay. Why did it go back? Wait. Okay. When I clicked on the waiting room, my Avodah Zarah got clicked. So
It's either there or it isn't
I
there.
tell you. Avodah Zarah is very strange. Stay away from it. Okay. I think we're on 75 in the Koran. I think that's what I remember. I'm getting there. Um, yeah, I know the page numbers didn't come up on the Xerox, but I almost there. Bear with me here.
15A.
It's good for the recording to this could be good for your eyes if you're going through watching the recording after. 15A, the red
15A,
S, the Mishnah
Correct.
teaches.
Correct. One, the Mishnah teaches.
Yeah, okay, here we are. Yeah, page 75. Good. Okay. Sorry about that. I tell you, technology, whatever. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we had left off with a discussion about buying livestock from Gentiles or selling livestock to Gentiles because we assume the worst for what Gentiles do with livestock, not only worshiping them or using them to sacrifice, but also taking advantage of them sexually. So there's that part of the discussion about what kind of business to do with Gentiles and how what we have to keep in mind when doing business with them. Okay, so we had gotten up to this red S last time, so we'll just pick up. The Mishnah teaches. Let me make it a little bit bigger. But in every place, one may not sell to Gentiles large livestock, calves, or foals, whether these animals are whole or damaged. Now, the direct translation of the Talmud is large livestock. The smaller print is what the commentary adds. Steinsaltz adds, usually based on Rashi, that it's also the babies of the large livestock. So calves or foals also. So so the prohibition of selling large livestock is not just for grown livestock, but for young livestock too. So, in every place one may not sell to Gentiles large livestock, calves or foals, whether these animals are whole or damaged. The Gemara explains. What's the reason? The Gemara explains, granted, we are not concerned about the Gentile engaging in bestiality with the animal, but we are concerned about him putting the animal to work on Shabbat. So there was a discussion before, certain animals, the Gentile doesn't engage in bestiality with his own animals, but rather with stray animals. That's the Gemara's thinking, apparently. So if you're not worried about them doing this with their animals, then what are you worried about with selling to them? Oh, well, you are worried about the fact that your animal was observing Shabbos by resting on Shabbat, because that's the fourth commandment says that your animals are supposed to rest on Shabbat too. And so if you're selling your animal to a Gentile, then your animal's no longer observing Shabbos, and you can't do that to your animal. which, when we talked about it last week, is just really a fascinating idea that Shabbos, not only Shabbos is an important concept. It's an essential religious concept for human beings, but it's fascinating that it applies to the animals that belong to the human beings that observe Shabbos too. That, on the one hand, we think, okay, animals are our property, who cares, right? So we're using, I don't know, we're using utensils on Shabbat. So we would imagine it wouldn't be wrong to think that animals are like utensils. But what the rabbis are saying, no, they're not like utensils, because animals were included in the commandment to rest on Shabbat. Then we worry about them when once an animal is owned by a Jew, always a Jewish animal. Okay, so the Gemara expresses puzzlement. And let the Gentile put it to work. Why should one be concerned about this possibility? Right? So now the Gemara is talking about this. Like, what is it? Who cares anymore? It's one thing when we own an animal to let it rest, but does Shabbos apply to an animal no matter where the animal is? Is there such a thing as a Jewish animal? Since he bought it, he acquires it and may put it to work on Shabbat, as it no longer belongs to the Jew. Right? That seems to be a reasonable understanding. The Gemara answers, selling it is prohibited by rabbinic decree due to the concern of lending and due to the concern of leasing the animal to the Gentile, as in those cases, the animal would be performing work on Shabbat when it is owned by a Jew. All right, so the rabbis, so this is an example of siyag la Torah, putting a fence around the Torah. So when you're lending or leasing your own animal to a Gentile, that makes sense. The animal still belongs to you, and therefore the animal cannot do work on Shabbat. And so the lending or leasing agreement has to include that the animal not work on Shabbat, because it's still your animal and you are obligated to ensure that your animal rests on Shabbat. So if you're not allowed to lend or lease your animal on Shabbat, it might make sense that you could sell your animal and be done with your animal, but the rabbis put a fence around it and to have that extra protection for the animal, so people understand business associated with an animal includes lending, leasing, and selling. So it might be too confusing to say lending and leasing prohibited, selling is okay. To make it easier, the rabbis say no selling either. Okay, so now that it just raises just an extra point about the bigger picture about what are business relations between Jews and non-Jews like. And if fences are put up to that put obstacles in a way of doing business, then the rabbis are teaching an important message that we want to limit as much as possible our interactions with Gentiles. Right, so that I think that could be something that we could learn, maybe not, but I'm suggesting that if you're putting up this fence, you're further limiting business contact with Gentiles, right? So the Gemara raises a further difficulty. But during that time period, the act of borrowing the animal causes the Gentile to temporarily acquire it. And likewise, by leasing the animal, he temporarily acquires it. Why then is it a problem if the Gentile puts the animal to work on Shabbat? Well, you could argue then lending and leasing are a temporary ownership. It's like selling your chametz on Passover. It's temporary selling, right? Even though we think it's permanent selling, it is temporary selling. So that lending and leasing is as if the Gentile owns it during that time. Rather, Rami, son of Rav Yeva, said, selling is prohibited by rabbinic decree due to the concern with regard to testing, as at times one sells an animal to a Gentile when it is close to sunset of Shabbat Eve, and one says to him, "Go and test the animal," and it hears the voice of its Jewish owner and walks because of his command. And it is beneficial to the Jewish seller that the animal should walk, as he wants to demonstrate to the Gentile that it is fit for labor. And in this manner, he is considered one who drives his laden animal on Shabbat, and one who drives his laden animal on Shabbat is liable to bring a sin offering. So there's further elements here that Rami, son of Ravieva, is bringing. Well, no, it's not just about the sale or whether, it belongs to the Jew or not, and lending and leasing might be different, or it might be the same as selling. No, it's the issue if you're engaging in this business transaction on Friday afternoon, and you might be falsely giving the impression that the animal's fit for labor because the animal hears your voice. Okay, I think that's kind of stretching it, but okay. That's what the rabbis are suggesting here with the idea of Shabbat, and that then the Jewish owner of the animal would be liable by then selling the animal. Then at that point, you'd be liable for a sin offering for having the animal work on Shabbat. Okay, Rav Shesha, son of Rav Idi, objects to the Gemara's assumption that leasing confers ownership. All right, so they're extending this conversation now. Does leasing really confer ownership? Right? I guess that could apply to leasing cars. Is it when you lease a car, because I've never leased a car before, when you lease a car, is the car really yours? Or does it always belong to the dealer? Right? And there's an extensive contract that goes with the leasing of the automobile. So possibly similar issues arise with leasing animals. And by leasing an item, does one actually acquire it? I'm just sorry. I was just making sure that I was recording, and I see that I am. Okay, and by leasing an item, does one actually acquire it? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah, even in a place with regard to which the sages said that it is permitted for a Jew to rent a house to a Gentile, they did not say that one may rent it for use as a residence, because the Gentiles will bring objects of idol worship into it. The objection is as follows: and if it enters your mind to say that through leasing one acquires an item or property, then when this Gentile brings the idols into the house, he brings them into his own house. Why then is it prohibited for a Jew to rent a residence to a Gentile, right? Airbnb, VRBO, is it okay to put up conditions on your contract if you're renting out your rooms or your condo or your house? Can you put conditions, say no idol worship in my home? The Gemara answers, idol worship is different, as it is particularly severe prohibition, and therefore even an item that does not entirely belong to a Jew is treated with great stringency. As it is written, and you shall not bring an abomination into your house. And this house still retains the name of its Jewish owner. So other things about Gentiles might be okay, but idol worship is where we draw the line. And when you lease your home or your animal, it's still yours, even though it's the ownership temporarily transfers to the Gentile. Your name is still on it, and therefore, if there's idol worship connected to it, it's your responsibility and then your violation if that happens. And if Shabbos is broken as well, then it's Shabbos is just as important a violation as idol worship. Okay, Rav Yitzchak, son of Rav Misharshia, also objects to the Gemara's assumption that leasing confers ownership. And by leasing an item, does one actually acquire it? But didn't we learn in a Mishnah from Tractate Trumot, an Israelite who rented a cow from a priest may feed it vetches of truma, as the animal belongs to a priest. And conversely, a priest who rented a cow from an Israelite, although the responsibility to feed it is incumbent upon him, he may not feed it vetches of truma, as it does not belong to him. Okay, so truma is that are those agricultural items that have been designated for Kohen and Levi consumption. Okay, so when you bring in your crops every year, when you harvest, a percentage of it has to go to the Kohen and the Levi. And that percentage is called truma. An Israelite has to take it and give it away or designate it, or if it's going to rot before it gets to Jerusalem, there's monetary value that's assigned to that truma, and that money then goes to Jerusalem, and then the Kohen takes that money and uses it to buy items designated specifically for Kohen and Levi. So when an Israelite leases a cow from a Kohen, the Israelite, when truma is not supposed to be touched by an Israelite, is allowed to touch truma to feed the Kohen's cow. And conversely, if a priest has leased an Israelite's cow, the Kohen, even though truma is at hand, is not allowed to feed the truma to the Israelite cow. Truma only belongs to a Kohen and to Kohen's animals. So a Kohen cannot feed truma to an Israelite cow, even though the cow is temporarily in the Kohen's possession, which proves that temporary ownership that concept does not apply in terms of forgetting about who originally owned and now who is currently owning. That's not a concept that applies. Is currently. And conversely, and if it enters your mind to say that through leasing one acquires the item, why can't the priest feed it vetches of truma? After all, it's currently his own cow. Rather, learn from here that one does not acquire an item through leasing. The Gemara comments, and now that you have said that one does not acquire an item through leasing, and therefore an animal that was leased to a Gentile still belongs to the Jew, the original proposal can be accepted. The reason that one cannot sell large livestock to Gentiles is a rabbinic decree due to the concern of leasing and a decree due to the concern of lending the animal to the Gentile, and also a decree due to the concern of testing. So you're worried about Shabbos, you're worried about the fact that leasing and lending is similar to selling, and leasing and lending is still your property, even though it temporarily transfers to the Gentile. So idol worship and Shabbos are still concerns, even in these cases. Okay. If you want, you can look at the background about what vetches are. Oh, and here's a picture of what a vetch is. So it's some kind of legume. Okay. So it could be a different conversation about feeding that on Passover to a cow. Okay, the Gemara relates. So a different topic now. The Gemara. What? No. Rav Ada permitted the owners of a donkey to sell their donkey to Gentiles by means of a Jewish middleman. The term here, desafsera. Okay, a safsera is probably loan word from Middle Persian term meaning middleman. In New Persian, it's pronounced safser. Okay, middleman. So The owner of a donkey, a Jewish owner of a donkey, can sell their donkey to a Gentile by means of a Jewish middleman. He reasoned as follows. If the concern is due to testing, in this case, the animal does not recognize the voice of the middleman, so that it would walk because of him. And if the concern is due to lending and leasing, since the donkey is not his, that middleman would neither lend nor lease it. Additionally, the middleman would not lease or lend the animal because he wants to sell it and does not want any blemish to be revealed in it. Okay, so by adding this variable of a middleman, maybe some of these concerns from before are no longer concerns. The Gemara relates, Rav Huna sold a certain cow to a Gentile. Rav Chisda said to him, what is the reason that the master acted in that manner? Right? Then we just learned you can't sell a cow to a Gentile. Rav Huna said to him, I can say that he purchased it in order to slaughter it, not to use it for labor. Rav Huna added, and from where do you say that in a case like this, we say that the animal will be slaughtered, and one is not concerned about placing a stumbling block before the blind, despite the fact that the animal could be used to violate a prohibition? As we learned in a Mishnah, that Beit Shammai say a person may not sell a cow that plows in the sabbatical year, as it is prohibited to plow during the sabbatical year, and the buyer presumably wants it for this purpose. And Beit Hillel permit the selling of the cow, since the buyer can slaughter it rather than use it for plowing. This shows that according to Beit Hillel, whose opinion is accepted as halacha, one may assume that an animal will be used for a permitted purpose rather than for a prohibited action. So in other words, some rabbis might be willing to be a little bit more lenient when selling to a Gentile, assuming that the Gentile is going to use it to slaughter, as opposed to letting it work on Shabbat or for sacrifice for idol worship. If the Gentile is just going to slaughter it for food, okay, why not? Be lenient with allowing such business to transpire between Jew and Gentile. Rabbah said, are these matters comparable? There, with regard to the sabbatical year, a person is not commanded to let his animal rest during the sabbatical year, as there's no prohibition against this animal performing labor. Therefore, there's no reason to decree that the sale is prohibited, lest he lend, lease, or test the animal. As for the concern that he is misleading the buyer and encouraging him to sin, he may rely on the fact that the buyer probably intends to slaughter the animal. But here, with regard to selling an animal to a Gentile, a person is commanded to let his animal rest on Shabbat, and therefore the sages decreed the sale prohibited in case he comes to lend, lease, or test the animal. It's one thing during the sabbatical year, when animals are allowed to work the land, to then not have to worry about what it's being used for, but when it's not a sabbatical year, we can't be so lenient. Okay, so maybe there's room to be lenient, but only lenient in a sabbatical year. Abaye said to Rabbah, and does this mean that wherever a person is commanded to allow his possessions to rest, it is prohibited to sell an item to one who might use it to perform labor, even if he might also use it for an innocent purpose? But there is the case of a field, as a person is commanded to let his field rest during the sabbatical year. And yet we learned in a Baraita that Beit Shammai say a person may not sell a plowed field during the sabbatical year, as it is presumed that the buyer will sow it. And Beit Hillel permit this sale, since the buyer can let it lie fallow during the sabbatical year. In this case, although one is commanded to let his field rest during the sabbatical year, he may still sell it under the assumption that the buyer will use the field in a permitted manner. In other words, Hillel assumes the best in people. Shammai does not. Hillel says you can assume that whoever you sell to, even a Gentile, is going to use it correctly. Don't assume the worst in Gentiles, Hillel is saying. Whereas Shammai is saying, no, you have to assume the worst because you have to be very, very careful. Hillel's saying, well, there's careful, and then there's careful that impedes business and impedes relations with with Gentiles. Yes, there's reason to be careful in certain situations, but in other situations, you don't have to be so careful. So, this is really an important idea, a really, really important idea, especially in the nature of the Jewish community today, which is so fractured between ultra-Orthodox and other denominations of Judaism, all about how careful we are in understanding law, right? And understanding halacha and how it applies in specific situations. Clearly, ultra Orthodox are really careful, really, really careful to the point where it limits who the ultra Orthodox do business with. And for some ultra Orthodox, they only stay within their ultra Orthodox community because of being so extra careful. And they cannot abide any kind of influence, non-ultra Orthodox influence on their life at all. Whereas the less ultra Orthodox we are, the more we become like Hillel. And it's just fascinating that the Hillel approach is, for the most part, except for 18 cases, every other case, every other situation of discussion of Jewish law always goes according to Hillel, which usually is a more lenient kind of approach to understanding and interpreting Jewish law. And it's really, I think, as a non-ultra Orthodox Jew, I think it's very important for us to remember this. And when situations arise in understanding issues related to Jewish law and interpretation of Jewish law, it's always best, I think what we're learning from the rabbis, it's always best to follow the Hillel approach rather than Shammai approach, because the Hillel approach tends to be a little bit more inclusive and respectful, that you're assuming the best in people, as opposed to Shammai, who might be assuming the best in people, but is not willing to take some chances on that, whereas Hillel is. So I think it just a way to step back from the discussion a little bit to understand, what principles are at play here. Rav, yeah, what were you going to say?
We could the Hill versus Shammai approach, taking something to the furthest extent, or the paranoid approach, also happens within the Jewish community also, and so it's not conducive to the people getting along with each other. Tyranny is Orthodox.
Yeah, right, no, yeah, but I'm just exactly. I would absolutely agree with that. Right, and I think that the rabbis were aware of that and suggested that the Hillel approach is the better approach to live by, to make a better community, but both a Jewish community and a greater community of the people among whom we're living.
You're not obligated to be paranoid.
Right, Arnie.
Yeah. Do you think that the Orthodox would actually agree that they're only following 18 out of the large number of cases that where Hillel is, the position of Hillel is to be taken?
So I think it's a bigger question about the relationship of how we understand our position as Jews vis-a-vis influence from outside society, and whether how much assimilation is good for Jewish values, right? So the fact that I'm dressed like this, as opposed to wearing a white shirt and black pants, is in some way, I mean, it's a silly, mundane kind of example, but it reflects the idea of assimilation. That clearly the shul hasn't told me that I need to wear a white shirt and black pants in my role as rabbi of Sharei Tefillah. That what I'm wearing now is acceptable as in my role as a rabbi, and that in many Orthodox circles, I think that there are rabbis, other or Orthodox rabbis who would dress like I am as well. So I think that the bigger question is about the assimilation as opposed to an approach to Jewish law. So it's how it's a question about how to preserve Jewish identity to the best way possible without allowing for Jewish identity to be watered down. And how much watered down do you allow until it's too much watering down so that you can't recognize it anymore? Okay, so I think that's the issue within the Jewish community today in terms of our relationship to not just our relationship to non-Jews as people, but to non-Jewish moral ethical values, and how much we let non-Jewish, so-called uh, Judeo-Christian values, right? So how much do we allow the so-called Judeo-Christian values to enter into Jewish practice, right? Like the idea of men and women sitting together in synagogue in prayer. Okay, is egalitarianism, no, is gender neutrality, a Jewish concept? And so gender neutrality is only an issue because we're confronted with it when we open our eyes to what's happening in outside culture, right? Gender neutrality was not an issue in the Talmud, right? It was assumed that men and women were sitting apart. And that was a Jewish value until in modern times it was questioned whether sitting together might impact Jewish prayer or not. Will it impact how Judaism, is it okay for for there to be women rabbis? Does that affect Jewish culture to a degree that makes it unrecognizable? So it's that kind of question, and even the Orthodox now, open Orthodox, are finally dealing with the question about the role of women. And it took for the conservative movement to deal with it. The year that I entered rabbinical school in 1984 was the first year that women were allowed into the conservative movement rabbinical school. But it's been 39 years. 39 years since I entered rabbinical school, and it's only the past couple years that women have been allowed to become rabbis, but they're not called rabbis. They have to have a different word, even though de facto they are rabbis. Okay, so that just shows how much what the process of this, whether we see it as watering down or Western values creeping into Jewish values. It's a fascinating idea.
It is. It is.
Yeah, okay, so Rav Ashi. So when we get to Rav Ashi, we know that we're near the end of a discussion because Rav Ashi is the last generation of rabbis of the Talmudic period. And some suggest he was the editor of the Gemara, or he and his generation were editors of the Gemara. So when we get to Rav Ashi in the course of a discussion, we know we're near the end. Rav Ashi also objects to Rabbah's statement. And conversely, is it true that wherever a person is not commanded to allow his possessions to rest, it is permitted to sell them? But there is the case of vessels, as a person is not commanded to let his vessels rest during the sabbatical year. And that we learned in a Mishnah, these are the implements that a person is not allowed to sell during the sabbatical year: the plow and all of its appurtenances, the yoke that is used to hitch the cow to the plow, and the winnowing fork and the stake. Okay, so these are vessels that are used in working the land. So you can understand perhaps a prohibition to sell these items too during the sabbatical year, because it's like putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. You would be possibly subconsciously encouraging someone to do work with these utensils during the sabbatical year. Rather, Rav Ashi said that it is possible to assign an innocent motive. One assigns such a motive, and this applies even though one is commanded to allow the item to rest. And anywhere that it is not possible to assign an innocent motive, one does not assign an innocent motive, even though one is not commanded to allow them to rest. Right? If there's room to be flexible, we let there be room to be flexible. If there isn't room to be flexible, then we can't. Okay, so that's an interesting compromise that Rav Ashi is saying, that if there's room for flexibility, we allow the flexibility to happen. Rav Ashi is 600 years after Hillel. Okay, so if we say the Talmud is edited, Babylonian Talmud is edited around the year 500, Ashi is around the year 500, and no, I'm sorry, so not 600 years, he's 500 years after 450, 500 years after Hillel, who lived in the first century in Israel. So different land, and 400, 500 years later, it's like the time between the Shulchan Aruch, when it was edited by Caro in the 1500s, and the time we're living in now. That's an incredible amount of time to pass between the Shulchan Aruch, the summary law code edited 500 years ago, and how we're living today. That's in other words, if we could transport Rabbi Joseph Caro and Rabbi Moses Isserles, the Sephardic and Ashkenazic editors of the Shulchan Aruch, to our time today, would Caro and Isserles and have them come to synagogue on Shabbat, would they recognize what's happening in synagogue on Shabbat? I don't know. I think they'd recognize the words, but I don't know. It'd be fascinating to try to come up with that. Okay, so here the flexibility when it comes to assumption about whether we're assuming the best in people or not is still a concept discussed 500 years after Hillel. Okay, the Gemara relates. Rabbah sold a certain donkey to a Jew who was suspected of selling large livestock to a Gentile. Okay, so that's the case. So I'm just going to use Michael here as an example. He's sitting right here at the table. So I sell my donkey to Michael, even though he's suspected. I don't know for sure, but rumor has it in our little town of Olney that Michael has a reputation of selling his livestock to Gentiles. So it's not proven, but there's this reputation about Michael. He looks like a kind of guy who would sell his donkeys to Gentiles. Am I allowed to sell my donkey to Michael, knowing that the assumption is that he's going to then sell it to a Gentile? Abaye said to Rabbah, so Rabbah sold the donkey to such a person who had that reputation. Abaye said to Rabbah, what's the reason that the master acted in this manner? Rabbah said to him, I sold the donkey to a Jew. Abaye said to him, but he will go and sell it to a Gentile. Rabbah responded, is the only possibility that he'll sell it to a Gentile and he'll not sell it to a Jew? Since there's no reason to assume that he will sell specifically to a Gentile rather than to a Jew, there's no problem in selling to him. All right, this is also fascinating stuff, right? Are we allowed to let reputations, ill-founded reputations, determine our business practice? It's interesting, fascinating idea. Abaye raised an objection to Rabbah's opinion from a Baraita, a source from the time of the Mishnah that's not in the Mishnah. In a place where the people were accustomed to sell small livestock to Samaritans, and just step back for a second. Samaritans are not Jews, but they are kind of like Jews. So they're in an intermediate category between Jews and Gentiles. Samaritans are not idol worshippers, but they are not Jews. They're not part of the Jewish community. They, from the time of Ezra, they are people who took on, they may have been originally Jewish, but people who took on Jewish practice, but not, and more Torah practice. In other words, there is a small Samaritan community in Israel today, and they sacrifice sheep for Passover. Okay, so Jews don't do this, but Samaritans do. And there are other aspects. The Samaritan Bible is very similar to the Jewish Bible. A couple words here and there are a little bit different, but in essence, it's the same Bible. So, what about a Samaritan? This in between kind of category. So Abaye raised an objection to Rabba's opinion from a Baraita. In a place where the people were accustomed to sell small livestock to Samaritans, one may sell the animals to them. In a place where the people were not accustomed to sell them, one may not sell the animals to them. What's the reason that the sale of small livestock to Samaritans is prohibited? If we say that it's because Samaritans are suspected of engaging in bestiality, are they suspected of this practice? But isn't it taught in a Baraita, one may not keep an animal in the inns of Gentiles? Male animals may not be placed with men, as they are suspected of engaging in bestiality, and female animals may not be left with women, despite the fact that there's no concern that they may engage in bestiality, and needless to say, it's prohibited to leave female animals with men and male animals with women. The Baraita continues, and one may not entrust an animal to a Gentile shepherd, and one may not seclude oneself with Gentiles due to the danger that this entails. And one may not entrust a child to them to teach him how to read books or to teach him a craft. But one may keep an animal in the inns of Samaritans, as they are not suspected of violating a Torah prohibition and engaging in bestiality. Male animals may be placed with women, female animals may be left with men, and needless to say, it's permitted to leave male animals with men and female animals with women. Okay, so these fears of Gentiles and what they might do with animals don't apply to Samaritans, because Samaritans follow the Torah. They don't follow rabbinic law, but they follow the Torah, and Leviticus 18 clearly states not to do bestiality, and therefore the Samaritans would follow it, and therefore it should be okay to sell to Samaritans. The Baraita concludes, and one may entrust an animal to a Samaritan shepherd, one may seclude oneself with Samaritans, one may entrust a child to them to teach him how to read books and to teach him a craft. The Gemara infers from the Baraita, evidently, Samaritans are not suspected of engaging in bestiality, yet livestock may not be sold to them, as they are suspected of selling it to Gentiles. So that's the fear. Samaritans can sell to Gentiles, Jews cannot, and therefore you shouldn't sell to Samaritans just for that reason alone, that they might then end up selling the animal to a Gentile. Okay, a little bit further, and furthermore, it's taught in a Baraita, one may not sell weapons to Gentiles or the auxiliary equipment of weapons, and one may not sharpen weapons for them. And one may not sell them stocks used for fastening the feet of prisoners, or iron neck chains, or foot chains, or iron chains. This prohibition applies equally to both a Gentile and a Samaritan. Right, okay. Abaye analyzes this Baraita. What's the reason for the prohibition against selling these items to Samaritans? If we say that they are suspected of bloodshed, that's difficult. But are they suspected of this? Didn't you say that one may seclude oneself with them, which indicates that they are not suspected of bloodshed? Rather, it's prohibited to sell these items to Samaritans because they will come to sell them to a Gentile. According to this reasoning, it should likewise be prohibited to sell a donkey to a Jew who is suspected of selling animals to Gentiles. right? If you can't do business with a Samaritan because it's assumed that they're going to sell to a Gentile, then I shouldn't sell to Michael in this as my example here, because he has the reputation of selling to Gentiles. So why is it allowed to sell to Michael, but not still allowed to sell to Samaritan? What's the difference between a Jew who has a reputation of selling to Gentiles versus Samaritans who are known to sell to Gentiles? And if you would say that there's a difference between a Jew and a Samaritan, as a Samaritan will likely not repent and will sell to a Gentile, whereas a Jew will likely repent and not sell these items, this reasoning is incorrect. But doesn't Rav Nachman say explicitly that Rabba bar Avu says, just as the sages said that it is prohibited to sell to a Gentile, so too it's prohibited to sell to a Jew who is suspected of selling to a Gentile? When Rabba heard this and realized that Abaye was correct, he ran 3 parasangs after the buyer who purchased his donkey to revoke the sale, as a Jew was suspected of selling to Gentiles, and some say that he ran 1 parasang through sand, but he did not succeed in overtaking him. 3 parasangs, it's a long distance. Like, let's say a parasang's a mile. So either the legend was that he ran 3 parasangs to catch up with the buyer and didn't catch him, or he ran a mile through sand. Whatever it was a difficult thing to do. It shows he was willing to do it because he realized he was wrong and he needed to fix this, but he wasn't successful in fixing it. So let's see if we can do these last 2 paragraphs before the S for today. Apropos the Baraita that discusses the prohibition against selling weapons, the Gemara relates that Rav Dimi bar Abba says, just as it is prohibited to sell to a Gentile, it's prohibited to sell to an armed bandit who is a Jew. The Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of this prohibition? If the thief is suspected of killing, isn't it obvious that it's prohibited? After all, he's the same as a Gentile. Providing a Jew who might kill with weapons is no different from giving a weapon to a Gentile, as in both cases one violates the prohibition, do not place a stumbling block before the blind. And if he is a bandit who does not kill, why not sell to him? The Gemara answers, actually, Rav Dimi bar Abba is referring to a bandit who does not kill. And here we are dealing with a bandit who steals, as sometimes he makes use of his weapon to save himself when he is caught. Consequently, it's prohibited to sell him weapons in case he kills with them in self-defense. All right, so there's the other thing about, so if a Jew's a criminal, you don't sell to criminals. Even if they might not be using it to kill, they might be more prone to be using these weapons too. All right, fascinating discussions about, not just doing business with Gentiles, but what kinds of business you can do with your fellow Jew based on the kind of person the fellow Jew is. All right, we'll stop here for today. We'll meet next Sunday, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the day and a good week. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.